Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris Herbert. I'm the Managing Director of the Joint Center for Housing Studies, and I'm very pleased to welcome you today to the release of Improving America's Housing 2025. It's been 2 years since we released the last edition of this report, and while much has changed, much also remains fairly similar. 2 years ago, when we released the report, the market was in the midst of an unprecedented boom in remodeling activity induced by the pandemic, where people were living, working from home, and the nature and quality of the house became ever more important. Remodeling spending hit a record high. In the 2 years since, remodeling spending has declined moderately, but still remains near record levels. Still, there are a number of factors that were evident then that are still evident today that point to the need for significant investments in our existing homes. For one, our homes are older than they've ever been, and so the need for maintenance and improvement is quite significant. Secondly, our households are older than they've ever been, and so the need to adapt homes to an aging society, to make the homes accessible and safe for people as they age so they can stay in their community, is also at a very high level. Third, we've had a record number of natural disasters, which mean that we need to invest not just to rebuild and restore our homes after these storms, but also to make our homes more resilient to the risks that they face. And lastly, there's an incredible need to invest in our homes to make them more energy efficient and to reduce their greenhouse gas footprint. At the same time, the market faces a number of headwinds in trying to meet these needs, and some of those are reflective of the broader uncertainty facing our economy, the threat of tariffs that will make prices even higher than they've been after the last few years of inflation, and also the changes in immigration policy, which may reduce the workforce at a time when the workforce is already facing challenges in finding enough workers to do the improvements that are needed. We'll be reviewing these themes and many others as we proceed to have a review of the report and a panel discussion to talk about the findings and implications of these findings for the sector. But before turning to the substance of today's event, I first want to thank ABC Supply, which has been the sponsor of this report for the last 3 iterations. ABC support is critical in helping us to bring this important report to life, and so we're really thankful to ABC. I also want to thank the Remodeling Future Steering Committee, a group of companies in the remodeling sector who provide financial support and help pay for the broad work that our research team does year in and year out. And lastly, I also want to thank the team here at the Joint Center who's responsible for bringing this report to us. Carlos Martin, who leads the group, importantly, Abby Will, who was the project lead for this report, who led the whole overall project, and then Sophia Wadeen, another one of the significant contributors to the report and significant writer, who you will hear from now. And so with that, let me turn it over to my colleague, Sophia. The floor is yours.
Okay, well, hello, everybody. Thank you, Chris, for that introduction. I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. So to kick this off, my job is to give a very quick summary of this entire report, but I encourage all of you readers to dive into the details for yourself. The report is now available live on the Joint Center website, and the link is available in this webinar's chat. So let's dive in, and I'll start with our new estimates for total market size. The pandemic, as Chris just mentioned, sparked really extraordinary growth in the home remodeling market. Total expenditures across the owner-occupied and the rental stock surpassed $600 billion in 2022 and have since remained near that elevated level. Between 2019 and 2023, the market grew by an average of 11% per year, which was more than twice the historical average of just over 4% per year between 1995 and 2019. And this remarkable growth in expenditures reflects many unique circumstances of the pandemic, which includes the surge in home buying, as well as increased time spent at home that motivated many owners to invest in property upgrades. Record levels of home equity also enabled many homeowners to undertake more and larger projects. And at the same time, the aging of the population and of the housing stock, as well as the ongoing needs to adapt homes to the impacts of climate change, are also contributing to this growth in the market. And this expansion of spending was certainly propelled by the owner-occupied segment, that's the blue bars in this chart, who accounted for more than 80% of the total residential remodeling market. The number of owners undertaking home improvement projects hit a record high at 26 million households, which was a 16% increase over 2019. And average improvement spending per owner also climbed to $4,700 per owner. And this was 9% larger than the level during the last market boom in 2007. Since this peak in 2022, total expenditures have declined somewhat as economic and industrial conditions have become a little bit more mixed. But this downturn has been mild, and spending is ultimately expected to remain near its peak through 2025. With the continued aging of the housing stock, replacement projects continue to be a dominant force in the market. Replacements of home components and systems, such as roofing, windows, systems, and equipment, accounted for 49% of homeowners' total expenditures in 2023. These projects typically affect a home's functionality, and they're very difficult to defer. In contrast, discretionary improvements, such as kitchen and bathroom models or room additions, typically reflect homeowners' preferences rather than needs and can be easier to defer. And those projects accounted for about 30% of spending. Outside property improvements made up 15% of the market, and disaster repairs were the remaining 6%. Spending on replacement projects in particular tends to grow as homes age and as core components reach the ends of their useful lives. So with the housing stock now being the oldest on record, the aging of our homes will almost certainly fuel replacement spending in order to keep homes in good condition. Even amid these record levels of spending, investments in home improvements and even basic maintenance still remain out of reach for many households. As we can see in the bars in this chart, homeowners who are in the bottom fifth for incomes spent an average of $3,100 on improvements and maintenance in 2023, which was less than a third as much as homeowners with incomes in the top fifth. Yet, as a group, these lower income homeowners are the most burdened by improvement and repair costs. Lower income homeowners spent the equivalent of 16% of their incomes on improvements and repairs in 2023, while that highest income group spent less than 4% of their incomes on these projects. And the high cost of home repairs and improvements makes it really challenging for many households to maintain adequate conditions. In 2023, nearly 3 million owners lived in homes that had multiple structural deficiencies or serious problems with plumbing, electricity, heating, or other basic features. And even though most homes today meet basic adequacy standards, many are still in need of repair. The Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia recently estimated that a third of the owner-occupied stock, or 27 million homes, needed at least one repair in 2022. And the total cost to make these repairs was valued at $98 billion. In recent years, there have been new legislative efforts to expand home repair assistance, which will be really important to help close these gaps in investment. Projects that influence home energy use are also a growing segment of the market. In 2023, homeowners spent $139 billion on projects that impact home energy performance, including things like roofing, HVAC, water heaters, insulation, and electrical equipment. These projects have become a consistently high share of the market, and they accounted for more than a third of homeowner improvement expenditures in 2023, which was up from 27% 2 decades earlier. And the growth in this energy-related spending certainly reflects the aging of the housing stock, as well as growing motivation among owners. About 17% of homeowners in 2023 reported that they undertook a project in the previous 2 years explicitly in order to improve their home's energy efficiency. And public policies that require or incentivize investment, such as the expanded residential energy tax credits in 2023, are also certainly helping to boost demand for these energy-related investments. In addition, the growing impact of disasters like hurricanes, floods, and wildfires has also spurred investment. In 2023, the country experienced 28 individual weather and climate-related disasters that each caused at least $1 billion in damages. This was the largest number of billion-dollar disasters on record, and you can see that growth in the green shaded area on this chart. And so as disasters have become more frequent and more severe, the disaster reconstruction market has expanded. Homeowners spent $23 billion annually repairing disaster-related damages between 2021 and 2023, and this was up from $9 billion 20 years before, after adjusting for inflation. And there's a growing need to retrofit homes in order to make them more resilient against future damages. Although relatively few homeowners undertake any disaster mitigation work, rising insurance costs will likely motivate more owners to pursue it. the average cost for homeowner insurance grew by 17% just between 2021 and 2023. And these costs, as well as the growing exposure of housing to disaster, will almost certainly drive growth in the disaster mitigation market. And so looking ahead, the remodeling market faces both challenges and opportunities, and I'll start with the challenges. Growing affordability challenges will certainly make some projects cost prohibitive, particularly for lower income homeowners who are disproportionately owners of color. There has also been a continued decline in homeowner mobility, which dampens demand for the types of projects that typically happen in the years before or after a home purchase. And the industry itself faces many vulnerabilities. The remodeling industry remains highly fragmented, with large shares of self-employed contractors and small payroll companies. In addition, a majority of remodelers are also reporting a shortage of skilled trade workers, and the prices of many key building materials are still elevated above pre-pandemic levels. And policy changes will certainly exacerbate these challenges. The introduction of new import tariffs could impact the cost and availability of materials, while possible reforms to immigration policies could worsen that labor shortage. As it is, the industry relies heavily on foreign-born workers, with immigrants accounting for 34% of the construction trades workforce in 2023. Still, there are enduring sources of strength for the industry. First of all, high levels of housing wealth will provide many homeowners and rental property owners the means to invest in their homes. And some of the changes brought about by the pandemic, like elevated rates of working from home, will also motivate spending. Demand for home improvements is also growing as homeowners of color and immigrant homeowners and younger owners enter into the market and expand their footprint. And the growing number of older owners will drive demand for accessibility modifications, as many of these households wish to remain in place. And finally, the growing need to invest in the aging housing stock to repair disaster damages and address future disaster risk, and to improve home energy performance will contribute to the strength of the sector, both in the near and the longer terms. So with that, we encourage you to review the report findings on the website for more details. And I now have the pleasure to introduce our panel's moderator, Cameron Sperance, who will in turn introduce our panelists. So Cameron Sperance is the new editorial and content director at the travel division of Questex, after recently departing his role as the senior hotels reporter at The Points Guy. Cameron has also served as a hotel reporter at the travel media brand Skift, and as a real estate reporter for the commercial and real estate trade publication BizNow. His work and commentary has been featured in outlets like Barron's, the Boston Herald, CNBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Boston Globe, where he continues to freelance regularly for the Globe's real estate section. Cameron has covered several reports and researchers here at the Joint Center for Housing Studies and the Remodeling Futures program. Cameron, thanks for joining us, and I hand you the microphone. Thanks.
Thanks, Sophie. I appreciate it. It's a great pleasure to be part of this year's report release. And as you mentioned, I cover several remodeling futures reports and have spoken to your researchers on a range of issues. So I've been enjoying diving into the report for new insights, and I'm really excited for today's conversation. For those tuning in, be sure to drop questions for our panelists in the Q&A, and we'll get to those at the end if time permits. But before we get started, I'd like to briefly introduce our panelists, and each of whom is welcome to turn your camera on as I introduce you. First off is Carlos Martin, director of the Remodeling Futures program and one of the report's co-authors. Carlos has directed the program for almost 4 years. Carlos is joining us from Washington, D.C., where he also serves as vice president for research and policy at the environmental think tank Resources for the Future. And I also have to say, it is always a great conversation for a reporter on deadline like myself. Next up is Allison Iantoska, partner president and CEO of FH Perry Builder, a custom builder that has been applying its craftsmen and women to building and remodeling homes across New England. Allison took over FH Perry from her father in 2008 and has been recognized for her leadership and business acumen. During her tenure, FH Perry Builder was named one of Commonwealth Institute's top 100 women-owned businesses 3 years in a row. Allison, thanks so much for joining us. Allison is also joined by Freya Harris, Executive Director of the Coalition for Home Repair. Freya has served in numerous executive roles, but with the Coalition, she has been coordinating a national network of organizations from across the country, including nonprofits, local governments, and churches who repair homes. The coalition's members participated in the Remodeling Futures Program's report on home inadequacy and repairs, and the coalition's staff were instrumental in disseminating the report. Freya is based in and joining us today from Detroit, Michigan. Thanks for being here. Last but certainly not least is Jamal Lewis, Senior Director for Implementation, Learning, and Integration at Rewiring America, where he works to drive the widespread adoption of building electrification. Jamal is based in Washington, D.C., where he's also the advisory board chair for the D.C. Sustainable Energy Utility, the board for the Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnerships, a member of the Maryland Commission on Climate Change's Mitigation Working Group. Jamal has been named a Young, Gifted, and Green 40 Under 40 award recipient for his environmental leadership, and last year was named a climate change maker by the New York Times. Thanks again to you all for joining the conversation. Now on to the discussion. So the Remodeling Futures Biennial Report reviews key trends across home, remodeling, consumers, and industry players, but it also provides basic facts about where our existing homes have been over the last 2 years. I'd like to start our conversation by picking up on an important point that Chris introduced, that the pandemic brought record-breaking investments in home repairs and improvements. But the magnitude of these expenditures has persisted since. Almost 26 million homeowners choosing to make improvements, a record of almost 30% of owners. We're still remodeling, guilty as charged. Carlos, can you walk us through some of the housing market conditions that explain this persistence? What, if anything, has changed with regard to homeowners, the kinds of repairs and improvement projects that they're doing?
You're guilty of a happy crime, Cameron, and there's one that we're happy to hear that you're committing. So it might be helpful to think about the 3 buckets of why we see this persisting in the post-pandemic world. And so starting with the pot of market conditions that existed during the pandemic. I mean, recall that there are massive personal savings, a massive growth in personal savings, and the fact that people were staying in their homes longer. So people were investing in things, and often in some cases, things that they had been putting off for a while in terms of repairs. But that really drove a lot of the changes, and that manifested in a change in the diversification of homeowners. So homeowners of all incomes started doing more repairs rather than the concentration that we had seen previously in previous trends, as well as more DIY work, right? For people who could afford and had the resources, the physical resources to be able to do that. So it was a very different entity, but that's continued in so many ways. The division among that market segmentation has returned to normal, to the pre-pandemic rates, but the overall magnitude of repair and improvement work is still the same. And that's what I'd say the highlight of the report. So why did the pandemic not lead to just a reversion to normal? And I'm going to quote Allison Iantoska when we say, we're not quite sure I don't think we'll ever really quite know how the pandemic affected the housing industry. It's going to be a while for us to figure this out, because even though those specific conditions have gone, some of the other conditions that existed pre-pandemic are still existing. And so those are the ones I think that we highlight really well in this report. And the 3 that I want to bring up are the fact that overall economic conditions still have been pretty good. Employment rates are still high. Income rates went up. They've leveled off a bit since the end of the pandemic, but certainly there's an ability to invest in one's own home. Secondly, there is unfortunately an affordable housing crisis. That means that existing homes are highly valued properties. They're still an asset. Home equity has been at all-time highs for such a long time that people want to invest. There's the ability to tap into that money and tap into the equity and invest in it. Another point that Sophia brought up is that we have been, over decades, reducing the amount of mobility of household moves over the last several decades in this country, which is a very new phenomenon, right? A lot of traditional home repair and investment money comes from being ready to put your house on the market, and then once you move in, making additional changes to make your home happy, make your family happy. But that has reduced significantly. But we're still having these top record amounts of investment in home repair. So I'm going to quote another member of our steering committee, Remodeling Future Steering Committee, Bruce Case from the DC area, who always said he believes that post-pandemic, we have a whole new idea of what housing means to Americans. The American dream is a very different thing now to many of us. And so that investment, that asset is probably going to be the long-term determinant of why we continue to see these high rates of investment in home repair and improvement. The last bucket that I would say is the physical reality, right? And that is because we're not building at rates of new housing at strong record at historical records. Our homes are old. And the report is very clear to note that the median age of homes in the United States is at an all-time high of 44 years. And speaking to somebody who's also entered into midlife, I'm probably past 44 years, that is a physical reality they have to deal with. That these homes are expected to meet improved performance standards of a modern new house, right? In terms of energy efficiency, in terms of appearance, aesthetic, in terms of so many of the things that we want out of a new home now, but they're old. And so how do we get to that point? And that's why we're going to see continued persistent high rates of home repair and improvement in the next few years too.
Absolutely. And not to plug recent work, but it seems like with numbers of people aging in place, deciding to age in place in their existing home, that also lends itself to more home remodeling.
And we could talk about that too.
Exactly. Let's turn to some of the supply side issues that are in the report. So it makes sense that we turn to you, Allison, since you are an actual builder and remodeler. The report reviews all of the key inputs that allow a repair or improvement to happen, including the structure of the industry, the materials, the technology of the products, and assembling them on site. But the one input that came up in more than one section of the report is the workforce. There are several points in the report, including the increasing average age of the construction worker. So let me ask you first, what makes a remodeling worker different from others in the construction industry?
This is such a significant question and one that gets missed or somehow passed over, or assumptions are made or tied together. So how we assess talent and skill on the remodeling side, thank you for asking this question. I'm going to use a medical analogy to start with. One has to be skilled enough to diagnose an issue, then convince the patient to undergo that sort of timely, costly surgery. But the kicker is the client's going to be awake the whole time and might ask you a whole bunch of questions like, how's it going? Or what are you going to do next? Or can we speed this up? So for that, I'd say remodeling requires 3 skill differences. One is this idea of sort of constant calibration, meaning that as remodelers, we're routinely tasked with navigating all the unknowns, like aged infrastructure that Carlos was just talking about, which includes antiquated systems and totally unpredictable client requirements. So our ability to really discern the root cause of issues and then integrate not only practical, but very creative solutions within the constraints of the existing environment is something that really distinguishes us. And even the slightest deviation in our work can kind of undermine integrity or aesthetic, and it's certainly around sort of expectation of what that final product is going to be. So this feels especially critical when remodelers are blending kind of modern upgrades with the existing elements. We have to exhibit a really profound attention to detail and have very rigorous quality control standards. So this constant calibration between the new and the old is a little bit of an art form, if you will, that I think demands this level of skill and foresight. So one, constant calibration. The second thing that I think is a skill differentiation is that our expertise really has to equal our versatility and this real willingness to customize, because every project is so inherently unique. And every remodeling project demands a really high level of customization and flexibility, and we're tailoring solutions around the idiosyncrasies of a client's vision along with the idiosyncrasies of an existing structure. So we're constantly adapting to these really diverse challenges in the market we're in Boston, historical nuances, architectural constraints. So when we talk about craft at this level, it's not only about the intimate knowledge of construction methodology and design sensibility, but also the craft of how we deliver solutions, costs, schedules, all while managing ourselves and our egos to a certain extent. I mean, we really know what we're doing, but we have to support people to understand that. So it takes a pretty self-aware, kind of patient, humble perfectionist to do this job. So that's the second thing, that our expertise is that versatility and willingness to customize. And then the third thing is obviously around client relationship, that remodeling really necessitates this elevated level of client interaction. And since clients are often so directly involved emotionally and financially, we really have to navigate that balance of our technical expertise and our emotional intelligence expertise. And we need to have the capacity to manage dialogues that are ongoing, negotiate challenges, offer clarity in decision-making. And so I would think that this level of client stewardship is markedly different from a more transactional communication that may be more common in other construction sectors.
Definitely. And I mean, hearing that coupled with, especially here in Boston, it's not just decades of home systems, it's centuries sometimes. I mean, is it safe to assume it boils down to experience matters, especially with
100%.
figured. So I mean, also FH Perry, I mean, has been around for decades, so you've seen the workforce shortage in real time. You know, how's it going? How's your firm dealing with it? And second of all, I mean, can you help us understand this relationship between the average age of the worker and skill set? Is it positive in some ways?
Yeah, so I did a little bit of like a generational deep dive on this. It is so positive, and we have to maintain that level of sort of positive focus. So first, how are we dealing with it at FH Perry? What I'm noticing, and back to this thing of we don't really know post-COVID what people really need quite yet, what the post-COVID worker needs or what the post-COVID homeowner needs. But I do know overall people at all levels really need more support than ever. So we're really trying to institute a more collaborative kind of mentor-driven structure. So what does that mean? It means we want to really leverage the wealth of experience from our seasoned professionals at the top while fostering this system of like continuous fresh ideas, innovation, positioning from the entire workforce below, kind of creating a learning ecosystem, if you will. So because everyone wants that support, this seems to offer it. I did the math. Our average age worker is 48. So to me, that sort of trends on the older side. Sorry, Carlos, 44. We're now into 48. I'd say we feel like as a company, we feel like we're trending younger because there are so many different things that are coming into play so quickly, and the older folks are a little more intimidated. So to that end, it feels like a both and answer to me to answer your question, that we need both to leverage mentorship and experience and that skill set and embrace the opportunities for skill renewal, if you will. So when you think about that generational divide, it kind of comes up in upbringing. So the older workers were raised with an incredibly strong emphasis on hierarchy, respect for authority, tend to be more structured and methodical. Since I'm pulling that average up, we were raised to like prioritize self-reliance, face-to-face communication, this long-term career development with an emphasis on like grit and perseverance. And that and the part that feels really important is this devotion, the time to give to and devotion to detailed craftsmanship. So we can't lose that. That is the value of what the skilled workforce is bringing to us. In contrast, we have the younger workers who grew up in an era of more rapid communication, flatter organizational structure. And so what we want is to allow for the transfer of those technical skills and craft while recognizing that skill renewal is going to come from that intergenerational transfer. So older to younger and younger to older. So breaking down the paradigm that only the older can mentor the younger. And the last piece I want to just say on this is that it also shows up in our aging workforce and the physical labor piece. That is a huge challenge. Workers in their 40s and 50s are in a different space and place because they've used their bodies. But we also grew up with a different standard around physical resilience and hard work, what it means. So usually we pivot towards difficult labor-intensive tasks. That is our norm. And of course, as we age, physical endurance becomes a limiting factor. And so we have to focus on efficiency and we have to focus on technique, but we need that skill set. So can we pivot that older mindset of, real labor intensive, the harder, the better, the more shingles I'm carrying up ladders, the better, to allow for the younger workers who may be able to may not have that same physical habits, but tend to be more comfortable with technology, and may be able to create ways that we can be effectively delivering that level of craft, the tolerances that we need to pay attention to through more technological advances or communication advances, things like that. So a term I heard, this was new to me this week, maybe people have heard this before, but this notion of gentelligence, where older workers can use their experience to really identify these essentials that we need for quality control and building well in craft, while younger workers can bring in this fresh idea of how to integrate tech, collaboration, for effective and consistent delivery. So again, that there isn't one that's more expert than the other. We need all of it. So I think it's funny, the world has moved so fast, and in remodeling, we always want to go backwards. We always want to talk about miter joints and biscuits and doing things in this very old-fashioned way. So how do we modernize building well? So it's super clear to me that we need a way to kind of capture the discipline and focus of the aging worker before we lose that craft of building altogether. So we need the older workers.
Absolutely. I know I said I was going to get to Q&A from the audience at the end if we had time for it, but one that popped up actually kind of came to mind in my own head as well is just as long as I've been covering construction and real estate in Boston, there's been the average age of the construction worker has kind of flirted with 50. You'll see it change a little bit, but there's been this long discussion of how do we do outreach to younger workers, bringing in a younger workforce as well. What's kind of the state of that right now? Someone asked in the Q&A, are folks seeing any movement towards bringing trades to high schools and vocational tech programs?
Yeah, it is the consistent question that we're sort of all asking each other. I think what I've noticed in the Boston market anyway is that the Builders Association and Remodelers Association are really taking it on as a cause and as something that's very highly valued and critical, both bringing more women in at earlier ages and then valuing this sort of technical skill, because those are two areas that have been dismissed or set aside, that our workforce is right there if we begin to kind of celebrate and populate it more. So having days in which young people can interact with our building force and come do hands-on experience and see what the workforce now looks like. I think there's a lot of attention, a lot of focus on that. It's not moving as quickly as we want, but I definitely see a wave of shift happening.
Excellent to hear. Now let's turn to Freya and the Coalition's network of local home repair assistance programs. I understand that this is the most consideration that the IAH, excuse me, tongue-tied, has given to the issues of housing inadequacy and the repair programs intended to address them. Freya, let's first pick up some of the delivery challenges that Allison noted in the private market. Can you expand on how your members in the nonprofit and public sectors are also experiencing them?
Yes, definitely. So the Coalition for Home Repair, our origins are in the Appalachian states. So many of our home repair organizations work in very remote rural communities. And for many of them, these nonprofits are their only options in terms of having any type of home repair delivered at all. Oftentimes the larger contractors, for-profit or entities aren't going to go out to these spaces. So it really became a matter of the community seeing those needs and figuring out how they're going to take care of each other. And so even though we also definitely have members in urban and suburban spaces, it is really our rural home repair organizations that helped us to kind of think about how do you do the sort of work with limited resources and folks really not being necessarily all that close to one another. So there is, of course, the rising cost of supplies and still shortages of contractors that require that licensing. But many of our organizations have really dived into those skilled volunteers, folks that maybe were once in the trades, now living out in these beautiful countrysides, and really saying, hey, these are your neighbors. How can you use your skills to help one another? So it goes back to really a little bit of neighbor helping neighbor. As many nonprofits were established with the intent of helping the community that they existed in, that is what our nonprofits do. They are not outside of their community, they are very much a part of them. And so they use the community and the collaboration that exists there as a way of getting services to low and moderate income homeowners. We also have a few of our nonprofits that are larger. We have Habitat for Humanity affiliates as well as Rebuilding Together affiliates. And there's a wonderful organization called Appalachia Service Project that actually helped to establish this organization. They are very much about building that workforce development, some type of model where they bring in volunteers from all over the country, actually skill them up and then put them in a van with a lot of supplies, and they go out and do tremendous work over a summer. So that is another way of reaching younger folks. They do definitely work with college students that then many of them turn around and that becomes their career. And so this is something that has happened in a space out of necessity. And oftentimes the greatest inventions are out of necessity. And so that is what our nonprofits are doing, are realizing that if they don't show up, no one else will. Because for those that with low income, especially, the possibilities of getting a loan, even if they have equity, it would sometimes is challenging. The process of managing all the various contractors that are involved in that, these nonprofits take away that burden. The services are traditionally through grants. Occasionally, there may be a small loan in addition to a grant if the work is beyond what the grant allows. And then you have all of this volunteer support as well as grant funding to pay for additional contractors. So it's been a long-standing system that sometimes it definitely has not gotten the light that it should have. These organizations have been doing it when no one else would.
Absolutely. And I mean, as you said, the report mentions resource constraints and policy experiments like in Pennsylvania. The report names it a home repair movement. Where is the movement going?
So yes, that is definitely where the coalition has begun to shine, in that we were trying to become a convener around this conversation, not just from the affordable housing, arena, but that when someone is experiencing issues around their home and its care, there's most likely also issues around the care of their own body, access to food, all of these things kind of interplay. And so what we're realizing is that even those that aren't in affordable housing spaces are recognizing that they are part of the conversation, because when they enter someone's home for one service, they realize there's all these other things like a hole in the roof or the water not working or whatever those things may be. So we're trying to bring this up not as just a affordable housing issue, but as a public health issue, a community stabilization issue, being able to age in place and maintain your generational wealth issue. All of these things, by just making sure that a home is healthy and safe, it has these tremendous impacts, that things that people just consider as repair, it isn't just repairing a home, it could be repairing a family, it could be repairing health, it could be repairing a whole community, a whole neighborhood, a block at a time. And so these things are seen, as incrementally, but over time could have transformational effects. For instance, in Detroit, we're seeing it. I see it in my neighborhood every single day. And just watching communities kind of become back to what they used to be, one house at a time, one family at a time, has been extremely rewarding as a neighbor, but also as a convener around these conversations. There's also within Congress, there is the Whole Home Repair Act that was introduced last year by Senator Fetterman. This year, it's Senator Fetterman and Cynthia Lummis reintroduced it. And this is modeled after Pennsylvania's successful program. Some of our members actually are in Pennsylvania and actually access this program. So we often get a lot of updates from them as to how it's working in their state. But the hope is to make it something available across the country. And its real intent is to help to coordinate the various funding and access issues that we see for people really wanting to be able to get to the money and get the repairs done. All the money in the world is not going to help if people can't get to it. So right now, this is a bipartisan bill. It would create a national 5-year pilot to support homeowners and small property owners with critical repairs, including weatherization, energy efficiency, accessibility modifications, and structural repairs. This bill definitely aligns with everything that my organization is standing for. It's like, how do we get the resources to the people who need it as effectively as possible so that a problem doesn't just escalate or get worse because you're on a waiting list for 2 years. And so a lot of things are about timing. The longer it takes to get something done, the more expensive it will become over time. So our hope is that this second time around, maybe we'll get a little more traction. And at least if we don't get this particular bill passed, that the conversation around funding coordination doesn't lose its momentum, because we see that not only at the national level, but also within our own cities. Their city government and state governments also have various resources that are also not coordinated. And the homeowner just wants to get the repair done, but they're being sent to 5 different places and they're being told, you got to figure out how do you get Peter to pay Paul. And that is just not, it's just not feasible or sustainable over time for folks. And a lot of times people give up. And in the result is they may give up their home entirely. There's a lot of predatory home buyers out there who are taking advantage of those that, because they are limited in how they can access resources, just say, fine, just take my home. And this was their American dream come true, but just because you buy a home doesn't make you rich. The home is an asset, but if it can't be maintained, it becomes actually a financial drain. And so those that are put into or have the opportunity for home ownership need to have the same resources to keep it. And if we don't talk about that in a way that actually gets some money and policy in place, we're simply creating a kind of like a wheel of returning back to an unaffordable rental market. So they'll end up leaving a home that was theirs, that they could have saved and passed on to generations or sold, and instead returning into a rental market that's even more expensive than the mortgage that they had. So our goal is to kind of cut that off at the knees and just fix the roof and all the other things and keep people housed.
No, that's excellent work. And thanks, Freya. Since returning to policy, I'd like to bring in Jamal here. I mean, the report talks about the massive investments from laws like the IIJA and the IRA that were being implemented over the last 2 years, having, measurable impacts on homeowner decisions. Before we get into what could be happening with these policies and programs in the future, I'd like to talk about what's happened and, what was made available. Jamal, Rewiring America has been working on messaging and comms since the moment the IRA was signed. How are you tracking what's happened beyond what's in the IAH?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for having me today. The report is awesome, and I think it touches on a suite of really important topics. I think one thing that stood out to me was just the growth in energy-related investments that have occurred over the last few decades, and some of those upgrades that were named in the report include things like rooftop solar, HVAC, insulation and air sealing, and the growth in those investments largely being driven by the recognition that energy costs can be reduced. They don't have to just go up. They can actually be reduced strategically through investments in energy efficient appliances and other energy efficiency measures in a home. As an example of that, we talk a lot about electric heat pumps. These are machines that can be used for heating, space heating, and water heating, and they're about 2 to 3 times as efficient as the traditional systems. And we find that households that switch to efficient electric systems can save somewhat of $1,200 a year on their energy costs. And we're seeing in places like Maine that have installed a lot of heat pumps that households are saving are reaching about 60% energy savings in the state. So there's a tremendous opportunity here with strategic investments in energy efficiency to reduce energy costs. And it's not just us that's recognizing that, consumers are recognizing that as well. We've seen that for the last 3 years, heat pumps have outsold gas furnaces, and we expect that trend to increase, in part because of the increase in incentives. You mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure law. Well, one of the key investments there was the Energy Efficient Home Improvement Tax Credit, which is a tax credit for qualifying energy efficient improvements, such as installing a heat pump, such as investments in weatherization. And in the first year where we have data, and this was actually also mentioned in the report, we're seeing that about 3.4 million families took advantage of that tax credit. And we're expecting that only to increase in the years to come. And that includes about 750,000 families that have taken advantage of the tax credit for solar, for rooftop solar, and about 250,000 that have claimed that credit to install a heat pump. And so we're seeing consumers recognize it, we're recognizing it, and so some of that data kind of underscores what was found in the report in terms of the growth in this sector.
Great. Now, I do have to address the elephant in the room, and that's many of these programs are in flux under the Trump administration. So is there something we can look to in the private markets that give insight about energy efficiency and electrification, repairs and improvements, and how that all might stand given where the administration is?
Yeah, and I guess what I'll say is just the broader point that it is really encouraging to see the trends that have existed in the past in terms of like increased investments in energy efficiency. But I think the reality remains that the process to improve efficiency of a home or to make investments in something like a heat pump still remains complicated and complex. We talk about incentives that exist, including the tax credits. We talk about the how difficult it could be and how difficult it is, and this was talked about, to find a qualified contractor to perform high quality work. We talk about the fact, and this was mentioned in the report as well, the fact that most replacements happened, or most of the investments happened in the case of an emergency. So waiting until something breaks and then being, put in a position to have to replace it quickly, which could put someone in a position to not seek, sort of the best option on the market, but to seek something that can meet their more immediate needs. And so those types of decisions are good in the short term, but may not be good or may not be as good as they could be in the long term. So we've set out to smooth out that transition for households and creating digital tools. So one of the tools that we have is our incentives calculator. And when I say we, I mean Rewiring America put out an incentives calculator that helps consumers navigate the availability of incentives that exists in their area. And that includes the tax credit, the federal tax credits, and includes the federal rebates. It also includes the increasing level of state and local investments in these types of upgrades as well. There was just a report that was released that found that energy efficiency programs have reached a level of like $8.8 billion. So that certainly has increased over the last few decades as well. And so navigating this complex web of incentives, which all aim to reduce the cost of these investments, can be really daunting in and of itself. So we're trying to make that easier by putting it all in one place. And then secondly, we have something called the Personal Electrification Planner. And this is a tool that helps consumers understand the various upgrades that are available to them: installing a heat pump, pursuing heat pump water heater, installing solar, and those types of upgrades, and then mapping that out. So what is it? What could the impact on my energy bills look like? What are the incentives that I might be eligible to claim to lower that cost? And then we've also incorporated networks of contractor quality contractors too. So you can understand what you want to do, how it would impact your life, how much will it cost me, or how much could it cost me, and then also where can I go to take that next step? So how can I reach out to a contractor? We've seen that just about 1 million people have used our incentives calculator, and about 30,000 people have used the personal electrification planner. And so these are two stats that we think kind of like hint at the potential in the market once we make the process to be more simple. And another stat that I'll raise, which I think gives us another glimmer into what we're hoping to see, is that there was a survey by Energy Sage that found that not a single heat pump contractor expects sales to decline. And in fact, the average contractor expects installations to grow by about 51%. So even, with the uncertainty around investments in from the federal government, we're seeing the contracting workforce see positive reinforcement in terms of the investments in this sector. And we're also seeing a growing level of investments by state and local governments and utilities into this space as well. So there's a lot of opportunity here. And so I expect in that 2027 report for the number of these investments to increase even more.
We always like to hear about wind in the sails. Allison, I want to bring you in here. Another elephant in the room. So many elephants. Hope no one's claustrophobic. How are tariffs impacting your business right now?
Yeah, we don't know yet. So far, it's mostly a flurry of email announcements and updates from suppliers who are really trying to help us stay ahead of it. Ideas of what we might be able to anticipate, but it all feels like it's, sort of preparing for the pending storm, if you will. So I don't know yet. The way we've addressed it is to include escalation clauses in our contracts. Like that's sort of a conversation that remodelers across the country that are doing the kind of work that we're doing, we're all talking about, making sure that we're sort of proactively and preemptively putting that into contracts. That's a fairly new thing for us. I mean, people have talked about it previously, but we're in this little bit of unknown territory. And I think we're all still reverberating from things that we didn't expect to happen when COVID hit. So we're trying to be proactive this time around and sort of pay attention to things. So it's a sort of a non-answer, but that's how we're responding and thinking about it.
That's really interesting that with all the chatter of the years of construction materials costs going up and up and up, that escalation clauses are only like fairly recently coming into play.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, for sure.
The comment earlier on motivations related to the cost of homeownership spurs another question for me that I like to throw at Carlos. The report talks about property insurance increases, but we're seeing reporting on insurance costs and availability and overall complexity almost daily. Carlos, how is this affecting home repair and remodeling?
Exactly right. I mean, this ties into Allison's comments about tariffs and Jamal's comments about energy bills, right? These are things that are bread and butter, kitchen table conversations that people are having about how much things cost and whether they can do things to somehow mitigate them or figure out an alternative. In many cases, if the cost of a home repair or improvement gets too pricey, people just simply don't do them and they delay them, and that's going to hurt their households, their family's health as much as it will their ongoing utility bills, et cetera. So in the report, we talk about insurance in particular being one particularly, headline heavy conversation that everybody's having, noting that in just the 2 years from 2021 to 2023, homeowners insurance, including all hazard insurance, increased 17%. Well above inflation, well above other indicators. And we all know that in many cases, in places like Florida, Louisiana, California, as insurance gets too expensive, and there's also been cases where private insurers will no longer insure homes. So these things all add basic costs to any homeowner, but particularly low-income homeowners who can't afford those price increases, those who are still mortgaged, and so they have no alternative but to find an alternative. In some cases, the state backstop home insurer, if that's all they have. So one of the things we talk about in the report not only are the fact that, the reality is, one is protecting your household's finances. The other is simply protecting your household, right? There are going to be disasters, and these are not changing. There's that great slide that Sophia showed at the beginning about billion-dollar disasters and their increase, but also the increase in disaster repairs that has skyrocketed, right? We are at almost 50 billion in disaster repairs, as reported through American Housing Survey. So this isn't going to be an increasing cost. So what things can we do? If you're paying higher insurance, you're paying higher repairs if you have any damage from any kind of hazard. Maybe look at ways that you can think about mitigation, things about fireproofing. This includes landscaping. This includes thinking about protections for elevating homes, etc. There are all sorts of ways that we can start thinking about mitigation and being a real source of improvement. It's an opportunity for remodelers to specialize in that, depending on the hazards in their area, but it's also going to be a life-saving opportunity for these households. And I'm conscious of the time, so I could talk about disasters for a disastrous amount of time. So I'm going to pause there so we could start answering at least some of the questions that we have.
Absolutely. So many good ones. Sorry that we're not going to have time to get to all of them, but there was a question about whether there's been an increase in FHA 203K loans that help pay for rehab, given the high cost of remodeling. That does beg the broader question of how do people pay for remodeling, and how has that been changing?
I'm happy to start off with that one. I'm curious to hear certainly from somebody like Allison about how their clients pay for their projects. Historically, and over the long-term trend, people use cash and savings. In some cases, and this still holds very true today, we're talking about over 60% of projects are funded simply out of people's cash and their savings, right? A small percentage of that, additional percentage of that, is through credit cards. And then people who are actually using financial tools, so home equity type tools are a much smaller percentage. We're looking at about 12% of those projects are funded through home equity lines of credit, et cetera. So these additional programs we would like to see certainly expand their availability. There have been a lot of reforms, particularly in the FHA program, to provide more liquidity for homeowners and tied to their mortgages to be able to do a lot of these home repairs either during the home purchase or after home purchase. And I think the question also spoke to the need, to the reality that we're facing right now in the future about the cost of these repairs and improvements potentially increasing. And typically when that happens, the likelihood is that people may choose not to do projects, right? If it gets too pricey, rather than resorting to a financial tool. But as those tools become more manageable for a homeowner to be able to entertain, certainly we expect the growth in them. But right now, the vast majority of projects are still by cash and savings. I don't know if Allison, you have any differences?
I had a quick comment as well. So one of the challenges with the FHA is the accessibility, the strings attached. It is not an easy process necessarily for a homeowner to utilize it, which is why folks tend to go the easier route of cash, credit card, and home equity. You would think, oh, wow, there's this great program that's just for this, that everyone will be running to it. Well, they're not, because it isn't quite that simple. There's a lot of hoops you got to jump through to use it. And depending on how dire your need is, even when you attach that to buying a home, like to buying a fixer-upper or something, it's a process. And you're kind of warned about that up front before you go down that path. So that was just one of the things. If there's going to be a increase of availability, if there needs to be some changes in the process, the policy around how do you actually use it.
Implementation's half the challenge. I want to correct myself. I was adding credit card with home equity financed lines of credit. Home equity financing is only about 5% of the projects.
Great. Well, there's so much to dig in here. Hour flew by. We could easily keep talking for the rest of the day and beyond, but we got to leave it here to be mindful of time. So, of course, the full report is available on the Joint Center for Housing Studies website, along with a ton of data and interactive tools. Just want to say thanks again to Sophia, Carlos, Abby, Will, and the whole team at the Joint Center for producing this year's report, and again to our panelists for giving us their thoughts on the report's content. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.